am not someone who is immune to scrolling on social media quite a bit, and I do come across quite a few posts about viral knitting hacks. I always love learning new things about knitting, crocheting, fiber crafts, but it got me thinking, is there a source of information that I might be overlooking in terms of knitting hacks that I haven't seen anywhere else? So I'm going to be breaking out my vintage knitting books, and I'm going to try out a few of these knitting tips and seeing maybe how useful they are for me or maybe for you in the future. The first one I want to start with is creating buttons. I have a few vintage knits where the buttons are made out of the exact same yarn as the cardigan or sweater that it is attached to, and I've always wondered how you can do that. There are two different kinds of buttons that the vintage books recommend. One is a square button, one is a circular button. Well, actually there's many, but I want to try these two out, a square button and a circular button. And I'm going to start out with a square button, and the square button requires 2 layers and you knit them the same. I did some gauge swatches and I've decided that for my buttons I'm going to cast on 5 stitches and knit 6 rows and then cast off. I'm also trying to see how long it takes me to make one of these buttons to see how feasible this would be to do for an entire sweater in the future. If a sweater has 5 buttons or 7 buttons, something like that, does this feel like it'll take days, or maybe is this a little bit more reasonable to be able to do in a day? I'm gonna go ahead and do 5 more rows and then cast off, and we are done knitting 1/2 of the first button. So let's just keep knitting. We've got 1 square done. I'm gonna knit a matching square, and then we are going to finish off this button. All right, I have the 2 little squares for my square buttons. Should I have made them slightly bigger? I don't know. I wanted to make them the size of the button that I would actually reasonably use if I were to make buttons myself. Anyway, the instructions now say that we want to over sew the edges together. So I'm going to use one of the tails here, and we're going to over sew the edges together, and then you want to put in stuffing. Okay, 3 of these sides are now sewn up, which means that I have a little pocket that I can put the stuffing into. It does say that you want to use stuffing. I wonder if, in the future, if I use a little bit of cardboard or something, but that means that it can't go through the washing, because it does mention that you should use wool stuffing rather than cotton stuffing, because cotton stuffing will get lumpy after washes versus wool stuffing won't. I've got some wool here, so I'm gonna stuff that in. I guess the other question is, how much stuffing do we want to put in here? Because I don't want it, I want it still to look like a square button. You do want it to have a little bit of structure. Oh, this is not easy. And this is tiny. Also probably my issue because I decided to make such a tiny button. I really didn't do myself any favors by choosing such a dark color. For those who might not have worked with it before, but the darker color the yarn is, the harder it is to see what you're doing basically. The stitch definition and the yarn definition just disappears. I have fully over sewn all 4 sides, and our button is lumpy the right word? It's not completely square. It's a little thicker, but that's fine. I think that'll go away with more time. But the next set of instructions says, make a firm back stitch in a line a short distance in from the outside edge of the button. I think that this is supposed to help keep the shape. But again, I'm not a very good hand sewer, so I'm gonna do my best, but please don't hold your breath for any beautiful stitching here. So after all of that work, this is what our little square, oops, oh, I dropped it. It's so teeny tiny, but it kind of matches the size of the buttons. This is a vintage cardigan that I'm wearing, and it matches the size of the buttons on that. It's a bit wonky. Now let's move on to the circular buttons, and then we can cover how they suggest, because there's a specific way that they suggest that you attach this to your knitting. The second type of button is a circular button, and the instructions say to knit a stockinette piece that is more than twice the size of the button that you want. Based on the fact that we used 5 stitches for the first stockinette buttons that we made, the square ones, I don't know if I should cast on 12 or 15. Let's do 14 stitches and hope that that's good enough. So I'm going to cast on 14, and then I'm going to knit enough to make it roughly square. Okay, so now with this, we are going to make a running stitch all around the square with one of the edges, and we are going to stuff it after that, again with the wool stuffing. So it says to make a running stitch around all of the edges, and I'm gonna follow the exact edges in the square and not make a circle because that's the way that I interpret the instructions. I'm just kind of roughly running my needle around the edges. Okay, so I have run a running stitch around all the edges. You can see that it's already trying to cup in a little bit. I'm just gonna pull a little bit on this edge, and it'll start to kind of come together around my finger. Grab some of my wool stuffing. So you can see that there's the wool stuffing on the inside there. And then when I pull on the stitches, it firms up around that wool stuffing. So now with it pulled tight, oh, I think this one's cute. It's a bit thick in this direction. So I would secure this by probably sewing through the outside round a few more times, and we're going to leave that tail to now attach these buttons. One of the recommendations that they have, and I've seen this again on some of the other vintage garments, is that you want to attach it using a shank, right, to make up for the volume of the button so that it doesn't stretch on the clothing, but to a small linen button on the other side. So you would have this button that you're attaching, let's say, to this fabric, but then on the other side of the fabric, there's a button right there that you are sewing it to. So you're not sewing it to the knitted piece, you're just sewing through the knitting onto the button on the other side. So what do you think? We've got a small square button, a larger circular button. Would you use either of these on any of your garments? Tip is for those of us who like to seam pattern pieces together, especially if you are vintage knitting. You're going to be knitting your sweaters slightly differently from how a lot of modern sweaters are constructed. Many modern sweaters are knit in the round, or they're knit as all one garment on like circular needles or double pointed needles, but vintage sweaters were often knit on straight needles and were knit flat and then sewn together. It can be sometimes a little bit difficult to match those seams up really nicely and make sure you're not having bunching on one side and stretching on the other. So this tip is meant to help with making your seams faster and easier when you are sewing knit pieces together. I'm not going to knit an entire sweater to test this because I don't have the time for that, but I'm just going to knit these little test squares. So the first square I'm going to knit as I normally would. So I'm pretending that I'm knitting up a sweater pattern where the sides at least are just plain stockinette, and then I'm going to sew it together. So I'm going to fold it right sides together because that's how you seam knit pieces together. You put right sides together, and then you, the way that I do it is I just overcast stitch, whip stitch. I think overcast stitch is the right term, but that's how I sew it together. And to be honest, I don't find it to be particularly tricky to line up the stitches, but if I'm trying to get like long seams done, especially for a long piece of a sweater, it might be nice to have a little bit more guides. So to test the new methodology that is recommended in the vintage book, which is to add extra edge stitches and always knit that stitch. So the beginning and end of your piece is going to be in garter stitch rather than in stockinette stitch. And this creates little bumps that when you put right sides together on your pieces, you can just match the bumps. You sew over every single bump. This is a bit faster and I don't have to think as much. And I can imagine that when I do this for an entire length of a sweater piece, I don't have to sit there and pin the pieces because I can literally just work bump to bump. But there are two things that I can think of where this might be a drawback. The first is that when I turn this test piece right side out, there is a little bit of a difference in the pattern or the pattern piece where the seam is. So I feel like the seam might stick out a little bit more. One way to combat that is to treat the bump as a marker for where you're putting your stitches in, but to sew the last stockinette or pattern stitches together rather than the garter stitches. The other thing that I can think of is in the case that you're not matching exact same pattern pieces. So for example, when you're setting in sleeves, this isn't going to help you because your sleeves are going to need to be eased in anyway. So this sweater that I'm wearing, it's a vintage piece and it has set in sleeves. So there is a seam here that someone sewed and you aren't knitting mirrored pieces, right? Like even if there's bumps here and there's bumps on the sleeve, they aren't going to match. So that's not going to help you, but it could potentially help you when you're having to seam long lines together, especially at like the sides of pieces or underneath the arm. That actually could be quite useful, and I could see that being quite useful. Okay, so now this last tip is the one that I've really been looking forward to. It kind of ties into, I think, one of my earliest videos on the channel, and that is adding elastic to your knitting. If your knitting isn't fitting you well, or if something is a little bit loose, you can add elastic thread to it or some sort of like elastic closure to kind of tighten things up a little bit more. And a lot of vintage pieces, especially those that had skirts or were dresses, included elastic in the waistline to help support the weight of the skirt. I remade a vintage dress that I had because I loved it so much, but I didn't want to wear out the actual vintage piece. So I recreated that vintage dress, but it is quite loose in the waist. I feel it does stretch down a little bit. And so I am going to try the vintage way of adding elastic to the waist of this dress to maybe make it fit me a little bit better. All right, so I have that dress, and we are going to create the elastic casing. The idea for this casing is that it'll hold the elastic in place. It won't encase it fully. It's just kind of a zigzag crochet stitch that'll be applied to the inside of the dress. So I've got my crochet hook here. I've got the exact same yarn as what I made this dress out of, so hopefully it won't be too visible. And I am just going to follow the waistline of this dress and apply the casing to that based exactly on the instructions. All right, this is probably gonna take me a while, so I will see you when I am done crocheting on this entire casing all the way around the dress. Pretty happy with how this turned out. I wish that there wasn't quite as much scrunching, but I tend to wear this dress with a belt anyway, so the belt will hide most of it. I'll probably need some belt loops so the belt doesn't fall down in the future, but those are all things that we can add. Slowly we're improving the stuff that we've made, make it much more wearable. I'm so happy with this. It also, like, it does feel like it supports the dress, like it doesn't feel like it's dragging down quite so much on my body, which is really nice, and it fits better without feeling like I'm being squeezed into something. So overall, I really like this one. I think this is a great little hack. I really enjoyed learning about all these tips. I'm definitely going to be implementing a lot of them into my future knitting projects, especially because I love vintage patterns. I love knitting things flat, seaming them up, and it is just nice to have another way to really make your knits fit better in terms of adding an elastic with casing. And it is a construction style that I see often in some of the vintage pieces that I own as well. What do you think? Does this apply to modern knitters? If you're a modern knitter, but you just watch this because you're interested to see what vintage knitting tips there are any of these something that you think that you could implement in the future? There's also so many other tips that I didn't go over. I just picked out 3 that I thought would be very, very useful, but there are great tips in here. For example, like, what do you do with a sweater that has felted or shrunk in the wash or has gone so loose that even elastic can't fix it? If you want to see what the vintage tips are for that, please do let me know, because I would be happy to go over that and try them out as well. I know all of our time is really precious, so I appreciate you decided to spend this time with me. I have some really exciting projects coming up that I want to share with you all, so hopefully you'll stick around for that. If you are interested, I think there might be a video up here that you might enjoy watching as well. Other than that, I'll see you again really soon. Bye!